Hello, and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Japanese Studies at the Sainsbury Institutes for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of East Anglia. I'm your host, Oliver Moxham, Research Support Officer at the Sainsbury Institute and researcher of Japanese War Heritage. This week we are joined by Hiroshi Ōta, Professor at the School of International Liberal Studies at Waseda University, to discuss Net Zero Japan. With the COP26 gathering and a recently leaked document revealing the Japanese government as one of many lobbying for climate change to be taken off the UN agenda, I asked Hiroshi about the rhetoric and actions of the Japanese government in the face of climate change. Together we explore why they are reluctant to impose serious reforms to their energy policy and what alternatives exist for their dependency on fossil fuels and nuclear power. We hope you enjoy the show. Good morning, good evening, Hiroshi. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So first of all, we'd like to know a bit more about you. Can you tell us about your area of expertise and how your interests have brought you there?
Okay. I was trained as a political scientist measuring international relations. While I was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York City from the late 1980s to the early 1990s, I studied international security and international political economy. Particularly, I was concerned about the possibility of a nuclear war between the United States and former Soviet Union. However, when I passed the comprehensive exam and became ready to launch research for my doctoral thesis, the Cold War ended together with the imminent danger of a nuclear war between the two superpowers. I was relieved from the tense feeling of anticipating a nuclear disaster. However, I became bewildered on what I should focus on for my thesis. Then I the issue of climate change due to anthropogenic global warming emerged as a global issues in the early 1990s, and the UN Conference on the Environment and Development, so-called UNCED, was held in Rio in June 1990, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. So eventually I chose the theme of Japan's politics and diplomacy of climate change as my doctoral thesis. Since then, I have been following this issue as my case study and teaching a course on global environmental politics and policy at my university. These are my kind of background.
I see, thank you. It's quite interesting that you went from the global fear of nuclear disaster to the global fear of climate change. Is there a direct correlation there?
No, but indirectly related, because I kind of read the doomsdays of nuclear war, and the Carl Sagan, who kind of warned us we're going to have a nuclear winter. But for the case of the global warming, just opposite, we're going to warming of Earth, and that will be kind of leading us to the different kind of doomsday in the future.
Fascinating.
So there's kind of connection in terms of security, the global level, of global scale security issues. And I thought, this is very big issues. And then I thought it is worthwhile spending time and energy.
Definitely. So you had an article published last year entitled The Analysis of Japan's Energy and Climate Policy from the Aspect of Anticipatory Governance. Could you start off by giving us a brief overview of the Japanese government's energy policies? What kind of rhetoric are they using, and are they following their words up with actions?
Okay. I think I'll start with the tenets of the Japanese energy policies, which was articulated by the Agency of Natural Resources and Energy of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industries, METI in short. Energy securities, efficiency, environmental considerations, and later added safety to these three E's, and thus now become a 3E plus S. Like other OECD countries and emerging economies, Japan has developed its economy and society through a dominant techno-institutional complex, TIC in short, consisting of energy, manufacture and transport industries fueled by fossil fuels. However, Japan's techno-institutional complex is embedded in extreme import-dependent energy insecurity, currently occupying the position of third largest importer of thermal coal and fourth largest importer of crude oil. Historically, this energy security focus was heightened by two oil crises in the 1970s, 73, 74, and 78, 79, pushing for diversification from oil through coal and natural gas, combined with an emphasis on increased energy efficiencies. Nuclear power emerged as part of the energy security discourse, with the first light water reactors constructed in the 1970s, tied into the challenge of ensuring that nuclear power plants operate safely in Japan's quake vulnerable geography by propagating the safety myth, Anzen Shinwa. Besides, the government and power companies stressed the economic side of nuclear as the cheapest source of energy, putting aside the cost of decommissioning and disposing highly irradiated spent fuels and others. Subsequently, with global environmental concern emerged in the 1990s, Japanese policymakers framed nuclear as a clean energy. Unfortunately, the conditional logic underpinning this framing manifests as a major obstacle for alternative development pathways in incorporating renewables as a key to CO2 emission reduction. Instead, for example, it resulted quick security and status quo solutions such as the push for coal and natural gas thermal power generation post-Fukushima accident. Likewise, this logic favors status quo nuclear restart when feasible and is shaping the emergent hydrogen economy tied into fossil fuel infrastructure plus carbon capture and storage. These are I think, just brief energy policies of Japan, I guess.
Thank you. You use the term anticipatory governance to refer to the Japanese government's rhetoric, a discourse which is all about preparing for worst-case scenarios such as nuclear accidents, as you looked at in your earlier research. However, you state that policymakers take little interest in data relating to climate change impacts on local areas, being more interested in solutions which only give the appearance of making changes without much substance. Why is there such a gap between what government officials are saying and what policies they're actually implementing on climate change?
Yeah, this is a very good point. According to the Energy Agency, the long-term energy outlook is drawn up by ambitious multiple-track scenarios and a multi-layered and diversified flexible energy supply-demand structure. At first glance, this approach resonates with the aspect of anticipatory governance that promote the idea of preparing for multiple future scenarios, including the unthinkable worst-case future scenarios such as nuclear accident. This is foresight. The interaction between the policymakers and public, which is engagement, and the reflexive processes of policy innovation with a normative decision of the selection of energy mix should be called integrations. These are the anticipatory governance. However, the actual Japanese energy policy and policy-making processes are far apart from anticipatory governance. I knew this gulf. Instead, the article you mentioned intended to show that the stated policy rationale does not reflect the actual policies and policy-making processes taken. As I argue elsewhere, the combination of politics of the incumbent or vested interest provides a plausible explanation of Japan's national energy policies. The incumbent, which seeks to maintain the status quo in opposition to a deep and rapid energy transition, forms a policy coalition consisting of concerned bureaucracies, the ruling party politicians, energy-intensive industries, and labor unions. Japan Business Federation, or Keidanren, the cross-sector peak business organization, directly influences the policy-making processes of METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Energy Agency, as an essential policy council member. Above all, power companies, energy-intensive industries such as steel, cement industries, petrochemical industries, and power plants manufacturers seek to direct governmental energy policy making, while established conservative politicians of the ruling party generally support METI and Keidanren positions.
I see. So it sounds like it's a combination of lobbying from energy-intensive industries and also a lack of desire to be the government that institutes enormous change in energy policy.
Yeah, they really want to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
Some kind of lock-in in the fossil fuel industry, I guess.
So with COP26 underway at the time of recording, climate change is now on everyone's lips, now more than ever, with nations coming under scrutiny for their plans on reaching net zero emissions. In fact, it recently came to light in a UN report that a number of nations, Japan included, had been lobbying to reduce international political attention on climate change. Given the increasing severity of natural disasters in Japan, why would this be in the interests of the Japanese government?
Yes. Japan is undoubtedly a natural disaster-prone society, and people have begun attributing to climate change for recurrent torrential rains and powerful typhoons. The recent public poll show that people consider climate change the most imminent crisis. Having said that, the answer to the previous question partly answered this question too. Besides, we need to pay attention to Japan's bureaucratic politics. When the economy ministry consistently exert greater influence over climate and energy policy than the environment ministry, simply because the former has direct material interest to promote and protect. The economy ministry, such as METI and Ministry of Finance, when the carbon taxes are involved, have high stakes in climate change policy, since their main platform require direct control over industrial and energy policies. The Ministry of Environment, and to a certain extent, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, can obtain some concession from METI only when ruling political party pro-climate interventions become evident, or when an upsurge of pressure from international environmental movements tied into major negotiations such as the Paris Conference, COP15 and COP26, raise the profile and urgency of the climate change agenda. I do not know who is now in charge of or influential in the negotiation for COP26. However, I can point to the absence of influential pro-climate and pro-energy transition politicians in the Kishida or the new administration. Taro Kono, a champion of renewable energy and denuclearization, lost the LDP party presidential election in October to Fumio Kishida. Kono, together with Shinjiro Koizumi, the former minister of the Environment Ministry, became non-cabinet members. The departure from the cabinet are crucial, since the cabinet meeting is the highest level of the governmental decision-making organs. Now, there is no influential policy entrepreneur in the government for the issue of climate change and energy transition. So we can, see that Japan is kind of taking a very hesitant role, and then maybe kind of pressuring to slow down the decarbonization thrust.
I see. So when you say we need to look into the bureaucracy of the Japanese government to scrutinize how energy policy is made and acted on, whose responsibility is that? There's METIs and the energy agency, but certainly there's a conflict of interest within METI too. Some bureaucrats want to have
more renewable policies, but predominantly the nuclear power sector is influential and supported by very senior politicians. But Abe Shinzo, former prime ministers, and then Amari Akira, who kind of served for the METI's minister, and then, not minister, but served for, came from the politicians working for the METI, and he was strong advocate for nuclear energy. But he lost these elections. Of course, he came back as a proportionate representative, but he was appointed first as the Secretary General of LDP, but because of his loss in single constituency elections, now he resigned the LDP's Secretary General positions. So I think he lost some kind of power in terms of energy policy making. So I think there are some changes occurring, but still METI is very powerful in deciding energy policy.
I see. So it sounds like we've been talking about what the national government's interests are. I can't imagine that the local governments of areas like Hiroshima and the multiple prefectures in Kyushu, for example, which have seen disastrous mudslides caused by torrential rain over the last few years, want to maintain the status quo. Are local governments taking a different stance on climate change from the national government?
Yes, I think so. Local governments are more kind of anxious and also active, try to make a very active role to play in order to alleviate the climate change, also to be able to adapt to climate change. But unfortunately, still, central government has a more, financial powers, and then local government has not having substantial, power to carry on the real concrete policies, particularly involving in climate change issues.
I see. Thank you. So do you have any sense of how the public in Japan feel about and respond to the government's energy policy and rhetoric? I mean, from what you've said about the results of the latest general election, it seems like those who were campaigning for greener energy seem to fare worse in the general election. Is that a reflection on how the public feel?
It's quite difficult to quickly answer your question, but I don't have any sufficient evidence or the data to answer this question. But I came across an NHK, which is Nihon Hoso Kyokai, Japan Broadcast Corporation's public poll of March 2021 on the nuclear policy. So only 3% of the respondents nationwide supported for the increase of nuclear power plant. 29% prefer the status quo or 9 power plants now under operation. 50% of respondents said they should decrease the number of nuclear plants, and 17% wanted to abolish them. Another public poll conducted by the Japan Foundation in February this year on the governmental policy of the 2050 carbon neutrality, more than 60% had a high opinion of it, but only 14.4% of respondents said that Japan could achieve this goal. According to private opinion polls, voters' order of policy priorities at the general election of October 2021 was economic policy. Second is COVID-19 countermeasures. Social security such as pension was third. Foreign policy and security. Then reduce disparities, measure against birth rate decline. Then finally, decarbonization, nuclear power plants, and energy policy. So that's the general public concern with energy policy are low. Despite the fact that people see some kind of a climate crisis is imminent, but still talking about concrete policies, people are not necessarily interested in energy transitions. It's very strange.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast to what's going on over here with all the protests that we're experiencing in the UK. There's a very strong public sentiment against inaction against climate. So
it's very strange. But talking about energy policies, the Kishida cabinet adopted the sixth energy basic policy on the 22nd of October this year. This is the most current, the energy policy. The energy mix of 2030 consists of 36 to 38% renewables, 20 to 22% nuclear. Now only 6% as of 2019 are under operation. And then 41% thermal, in which 19% coal and 1% hydrogen and ammonia. So despite the government rhetoric of mainstreaming renewables, the reality defies it. The government still considers nuclear energy one of the important baseload energy sources, insisting on its low cost. However, many energy experts and critics point to the fact that the cost of per kilowatt hour generation by nuclear is no longer cheaper than solar, as the government itself also recognizes. Moreover, if the cost of new safety measures, decommissioning power plants and nuclear waste disposal are included in the calculation, the entire cost of nuclear operation would be way too expensive. But still, government stick to this nuclear energies, but because of maybe they are lacking this institution they created since 1970. And then they have a very strong, vested interest, I guess. So incumbent is very strong.
Definitely. Well, on that topic, I have one final question, which is slightly off topic, but nonetheless relevant to this discussion. As a big fan of Japan's onsen hot springs, I'm well aware that the Japanese archipelago is one of the most geothermally active regions in the world. So why hasn't geothermal energy received more attention as a greener alternative to coal and nuclear power?
I love onsen too. Okay. Before trying to answer this question, I would like to mention the current state of Earth on geothermal energy use in the world. Okay. In the global energy landscape, geothermal is not the primary alternative to fossil fuel. For instance, as of 2018, the global geothermal energy production was 88 terawatt per hour, or just 1% of the total electricity generated from renewable. Japan was the ninth in the top 10 nations having the most installed geothermal power generation in 2020. So in passing, the top 5 nations are the United States, Indonesia, the Philippines, Turkey, and Kenya in descending order. So having said this, I think the cost, locations, and conflict of interest are the reason why the development of geothermal energy has not sharply increased in Japan, despite its potential. A geothermal plant facility is huge and requires relatively a large area, so that the cost of constructing it is pretty high. Another problem is the location. Most of the land suitable for geothermal plants are in national parks. Thus, it is not easy to develop a large-scale plant to meet cost-effective in power production. Lastly, similarly, the suitable location for geothermal are mostly close to the hot spring lava spot, as many, including yourself, enjoy onsen along with the surrounding beautiful scenery. Hence, there are conflict interests between energy developers and hot spring resort towns and onsen enthusiasts. So the cost, location, and conflict of interest are main reason why Japan cannot having more geothermal power plants.
I see. So it's definitely not a simple alternative to nuclear power.
Yeah. Unfortunately, geothermal only, I think, 0.2% in the renewable energy in Japan. So very small,
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering all of my questions, Hiroshi. Before we finish the episode, could you share with us what other projects you're currently working on?
Okay. I'm currently working on another research project funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, JSPS, about the geopolitics of renewables and governance of energy transition in comparison with the EU, especially Germany, and the US, China, and Japan, with a focus on the case of Japan. In general, renewable energy system can provide a state with energy security, since natural energy sources can be developed within the border, not relying on foreign sources. However, there is already competition for the leadership to develop the next generation of clean technologies among these countries I mentioned in the region. Besides, the materials necessary for renewable technologies such as solar panels, windmills, batteries, EVs, etc., are not evenly distributed globally. The supply of crucial materials, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, and rare earth, is concentrated in a single or very few countries. Cobalt, rare earth, and tellurium are mostly in Democratic Republic Congo, China, and Australia. In Australia, China, DR Congo, and South Africa largely produce the metals for lithium-ion batteries. The production of metals for PV is concentrated in Japan, Korea, Canada, and Russia. China possesses most of cobalt and lithium. So there's lots of kind of geopolitical issue will be over those very important materials for renewable technologies. Regarding energy transition governance, we need to deal with the heterogeneous actors and different energy supply systems, or centralized or decentralized. I do not want to go into detail, but there will be a conflict between the incumbent of the current techno-institutional complex, as I mentioned previously, and the challenger of newcomers. Since renewable requires much larger area to generate the same amount of electricity as fossil nuclear power plants do, we expect, unfortunately, have more conflict between renewable developers and local people. So I think I can doing some initial literature survey, a kind of they're suggesting that we need democratic decision-making procedures and participatory governance by respecting transparency, accountabilities, inclusiveness, and substantive dialogue, and fair representation, I guess. So these are the issues I'm doing.
Fascinating. We'll look forward to seeing what comes out of that. Thank you for joining us today, Hiroshi. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, thank you for having me.
You can find a link to Hiroshi's research profile in the description below. Next week we'll be joined once more by Dr. Paula R. Curtis to discuss historians and online harassment. Paula will share with me her experiences of being harassed by neto uyoku, far-right nationalists who seek to hassle and discredit historians for their critical approach to Japan's war history, as well as offer advice for researchers of controversial history who run afoul of nationalist netizens. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you for listening.